Today's lecture will focus on politics between 1870 and 1900. It will be the final lecture of this series, which looks at the 19th century, and it will be divided into two parts. The first part will look at political corruption between 1870 and 1900, and the second part will look at the farmers and the way that they organized during this period. There were several challenges in post-bellum America. One of these was political corruption, and this will be the focus of today's lecture. There were also problems with race relations, which we talked about in a previous lecture. There were problems with farming and farmers making enough money to survive, to support their families, and we'll talk about that in the second half of this lecture. And there are also problems with weak presidents, and that will really be the focus of the first section of this lecture, because it was an extremely important theme during this period. The period was known as the Gilded Age, and this was actually coined by Mark Twain in a co-authored book written with Charles Dudley Warner in 1873, known as The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. And basically what this book did was it satirized corruption in post-Civil War society and politics. And during this period, politicians focused more on business interests in exchange for political support and wealth. And that's why Mark Twain chose to write this book. Graft and bribery were also common, and that is one of the focuses that we'll look at today. Here's an illustration from Mark Twain's Gilded Age, which was published in 1873. And the illustrations in this chapter reveal the cost of doing business in Washington during this age of materialism and corruption. And if you can look closely at this, I don't know if it's clear enough for you to tell, but it says that the cost of obtaining a female lobbyist's support was set at $10,000, while that of a male lobbyist or a high moral senator can be had for $3,000. So Mark Twain here is satirizing the political landscape in Washington during this period. Now, machine politics is a prime example of the type of corruption which was manifest in local and national politics of the era. And this is one of the elements that led to Mark Twain's satirization of this period. The primary form for relief of working urban America, particularly the immigrants during this period, was known as machine politics. And machine politics is basically the process by which every citizen of a city, no matter their ethnicity or race, was a ward resident with an alderman who spoke on their behalf at the city hall. Now you can think, a good example of this is you can think of the movie Gangs of New York by Martin Scorsese. This is a prime example of machine politics in which you have the butcher who goes to the politicians and asks for favors from the politicians in return for support. Now, for everyday challenges, sanitation problems or a sidewalk on the muddy roads, citizens would approach the alderman to find a problem. And the aldermen were better than having to mess with the bureaucracy of the city hall because they basically worked within the machine of local politics to find a speedy and mutually beneficial solution for their wards. As I mentioned before in relation to the Gangs of New York, favors were done in exchange for votes, and votes were given for fast solutions, and the price of the solutions included a kickback to the boss. Now, obviously, this was not a democratic or effective way of running a city, but it did occur in numerous cities in the United States during this period. A prime example of this was known as Tammany Hall in New York. And this was run by the machine boss William Tweed, with assistance from a man by the name of George Washington Plunkett. Now, in New York, citizens knew that problems would be addressed for votes. And this was mutually beneficial, as we discussed. It would be timely for the citizens, and the politicians would get votes. So let's imagine that in Little Italy they needed a sidewalk. The district captain would approach the boss, in this case William Tweed. William Tweed would contact the city politician and tell them that he wanted a sidewalk in return for votes. The boss would get funds, William Tweed would get funds to pay friends for the sidewalk, and the friends would give a kickback to the boss known as graft. Now, despite corrupt nature, Tammany Hall essentially ran New York politics from 1850s to the 1930s, so it was extremely important during this period, and the significance of machine politics should not be underestimated. However, machine politics could also be found in other cities, including Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, St. Louis, and Kansas City, which all had machine politics. Here's a picture of William Tweed found in a newspaper from the period. So he was well known throughout the country. Now, ultimately, the corrupt politics, particularly on the national level, was really set in stone, or the stage was set, because of the election of 1876. Now, we talked a little bit about the election of 1876 in the first lecture in this class, which dealt with Reconstruction. But we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about it now. Now, if you remember from the previous lectures, the country was in the middle of an economic turndown because of the Panic of 1837. And this economic turndown lasted until 1879. The depression which the country went through basically assured that President Ulysses S. Grant would not be reelected. So the Republicans advocated that their candidate should be Rutherford B. Hayes, who basically advocated for both hard money, namely an economy based on gold, which would protect against inflation, etc., and also qualifications for government officials, namely that government jobs in the past have been handed out as spoils, and he wanted to do away with this. And we'll talk more about the spoils system in a minute. Now, Hayes was an ideal political candidate because unlike Grant, who dealt with the Credit Mobilier of America scandal and other scandals which we talked about in the first lecture, he didn't have any problems. Now, the Democrats nominated Samuel J. Tilden, who was the governor of New York and a self-made millionaire, to be their candidate. And Tilden was also an ideal candidate because he fought corruption in New York City, particularly Tammany Hill and its boss, William Tweed, who was actually jailed during Tilden's governorship. Now, both parties tapped into the popular sentiment with candidates, and they both promised reform and to end corruption in Washington. And both candidates also promised the end of Reconstruction, so that was a significant point. Now, in terms of strategy, the Democrats put light on the Republican scandals, and the Republicans basically used what was known as a bloody shirt campaign. Now, a bloody shirt campaign basically was a campaign which focused on the bad things which the Democrats had done in the past. In this case, it reminded the nation of the terrible human toil of war against the Southern Confederates, which were now essentially the Democratic Party. So they used this against the Democrats in their campaign. Now, in the 1876 campaign, neither Hayes nor Tilden campaigned actively. In fact, they relied on supporters to do that, which was the style of the day. The Democrats obviously relied on the KKK and other supremacist organizations in the South to intimidate blacks and Republicans. We talked about that in a previous lecture. In fact, the red shirts, which were based in Mississippi and the Carolinas, attacked freedmen who attempted to vote, and actually whipped them openly in the streets while they simultaneously held barbecues for their supporters on the other side. Now, Tilden ultimately won the popular vote by 300,000 votes, as we discussed about in the previous election, or the previous lecture. However, he only had 184 electoral votes, and he needed 185 to win the election. As we discussed about in the previous lecture, 3 states were disputed during this period: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. And they were basically charged with voter fraud and miscounting during this period. As mentioned in the previous lecture, the validity of one of the 3 electors in Oregon was also cast in doubt. However, ultimately this was dealt with before the end of the year. However, as mentioned in a previous lecture, the House of Representatives established a special electoral commission to determine who won the election, and particularly deal with the controversial electoral votes found in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. Now, here are some campaign posters from Hayes and Tilden during this period, which give you an illustration of how campaigns were held. And as mentioned, the Electoral Commission and all the actions which took place after the election of 1876 ultimately resulted in the Compromise of 1877, in which Republican leaders offered Southern Democrats a deal, namely that in return for Hayes being elected, he would withdraw all troops from the 3 southern states and end the Reconstruction. As mentioned in the previous lecture, there were also other results from the Compromise of 1877. But the significant point about this compromise is that it permitted Southern Democrats to end federal intervention and control their own destiny, which was an important win, and they were willing to cede the presidency in return for this. Now, as mentioned in the previous lecture, Hayes won the vote 8-7 in the Special Commission, and this ultimately allowed him to win the electoral vote 185 to 184. Now, here is a cartoon related to the 1877 Compromise. And basically what this cartoon illustrates, and this is significant during this period, is that the 1877 Compromise essentially avoided another civil war. So, basically you can see the hand of a Republican on top of the hand of a Southern Democrat who is reaching for his gun, and the title of the piece of paper on the table says Tilden or Blood. So you can see that people were seriously concerned that another civil war would break loose. And that was sort of a hidden background of the 1877 Compromise. Here's another cartoon related to the 1877 Compromise. And here, a powerful Republican Party leader known as Roscoe Conkling is shown as the devil. And Hayes actually walks off with the prize of the 1876 election, the South, who is personified as a woman. All right. Now, this also satirized this period. Now, there were several key results of the Compromise of 1877. And although Hayes' election didn't create corruption in the capital, it did set the agenda and inefficiency in the White House for the next 24 years. Weak president after weak president took the office of the presidency for the next 24 years. No incumbent significantly was re-elected during this period. So in other words, no president held 2 terms consecutively. They didn't have much power, and they barely were able to repay political favors for elections. And that's a significant point because basically the 4 years of all of these presidents was spent repaying favors and managing the relationships which got them elected. As a result of this, and this brings us to the second point in this slide, everyday Americans were basically left on their own during this period. And few issues were addressed which related to everyday Americans, such as patronage, tariffs, and the nation's monetary system. Now, the spoils system, as I mentioned before, basically ran politics during this period, and it was at the heart of every administration. Now, basically, what the spoils system was the power of the president to practice political patronage. And political patronage basically meant naming friends and supporters to political posts in the government. These could be local posts, these could be national posts, but the president during this period was basically overly concerned with naming these posts and neglected their other responsibilities as a result. Now, this was basically the case since the advent of the two-party system and universal male suffrage during the Jacksonian era. And in fact, Andrew Jackson, appointed supporters and friends to over 400 positions in the U.S. Postal Service alone during his presidency. However, during this period, between 1870 and 1900, this also was a major theme in U.S. politics. Now here's a cartoon from the period which mocks the spoils system and Jacksonian politics. As you can see, there is a picture of Andrew Jackson riding a pig with dollar signs on the saddles, and at the base of the memorial it says, "To the victors belong the spoils." Now, in terms of political patronage, it's noteworthy that every single president elected from 1876 to 1892 won despite having less than 50% of the popular vote. Now, when you earn less or when you achieve less than 50% of the popular vote, this basically necessitates the fact that you need patronage. And it allowed those with political influence in the government to ascend to very powerful positions within the U.S. system. And basically this was regardless of any experience or skill. Now ultimately this had 2 key results, namely a very inefficient government, a very inefficient federal government in particular, and numerous opportunities for corruption. At the same time, there was a movement to reform the practice of political appointments. In fact, as early as 1872, civil service reformers in the United States created what is known as the Liberal Republican Party to unseat President Ulysses S. Grant, who was actually a member of their party. Now, this was ultimately led by Midwestern Republican leaders and newspaper editors. And this was actually an impetus for reform-minded Republicans to break free from the party. And they actually appointed their own presidential candidate in 1872, namely Horace Greeley. And Horace Greeley called for a thorough reform of civil service as being one of the most pressing needs facing the nation. Now, Greeley was ultimately easily defeated, but it did set a stage for a stronger push for patronage reform and the unseating of this corrupt system. Now, President Hayes was ultimately not prepared for reform after the Compromise of 1877. However, he did have a preference for a new civil service system, though he wasn't able to implement this. In fact, President Hayes accomplished very little during his 4 years in office, other than giving favors to Republican Party handlers who helped him get in office. Now, there were two powerful Republicans who attempted to control Hayes during his presidency. One was Roscoe Conkling, who we already saw a picture of in a cartoon where he was displayed or portrayed as the devil. Now, Conkling was a Republican senator from New York, and he was also the leader of a party or a group of individuals within the Republicans known as the Stalwarts. Now, this group supported the spoils system wholeheartedly, and they did not want patronage reform. The other individual who attempted to control Hayes was known as James G. Blaine, and he was a Republican senator from Maine and a leader of another subsect of the Republican parties known as the half-breeds. Now, it's assumed that this nickname was given to this subsect by the Stalwart supporters, who considered Blaine's group to be only half Republican, because they did advocate for civil service reform in some respects. However, Hayes' presidency was basically influenced by these two individuals. Conkling, who was leader of the Stalwarts, who were very much in favor of the spoils system, and Blaine, who was leader of the half-breeds, who was somewhere in the middle. Now here's a cartoon mocking Conkling, and this was a popular game during the period, a puzzle game in which you had to reorganize pieces within a board. And this basically shows the heads of potential Republican candidates being manipulated by Conkling. Now, as mentioned, Hayes' efforts and Hayes' civil service reform were ultimately stymied during this period. And he achieved very, very little. His efforts to ensure African American civil rights were also stymied in this period as a result of Democratic control of Congress. And he really issued no significant legislation during his presidency. However, as mentioned before, there were overtures that were made towards a civil service reform. And there are actually two key points here. Firstly, he wanted to adopt a new patronage rule, namely that an appointed person could be dismissed for political reasons. And secondly, He wanted to make it clear that party leaders, namely Conkling in particular, would have no say in political appointments. However, Conkling in particular sought to continue his influence, but it is noteworthy that Hayes, through these 2 points, did set things in the right direction. Now, Hayes' ultimate target was to remove a man by the name of Chester A. Arthur, who was a strong Conkling man, from his post as head of New York City's Custom House. And Arthur was notorious for using his post as a customs collector to gain favors from Conkling. Now, Hayes ultimately removed him from his position. However, even the half-breeds, who I mentioned, were against the spoil system in some respects and wanted civil service reform, questioned the wisdom of this move, and they ultimately distanced themselves from Hayes. And as a result, Hayes got no political support, and there was also no re-election campaign for Hayes. So he was a one-term president, a one and done. Now, since Hayes was not going to be the presidential candidate in the 1880 presidential election, the Republicans had to choose a worthy candidate. The stalwarts ultimately chose Ulysses S. Grant, who was previously President of the United States, and the half-breeds chose James Blaine. Now, these 2 nominations ultimately resulted in a convention deadlock. However, the factions agreed to a compromise presidential candidate, namely James A. Garfield from Ohio, with Chester A. Arthur as his vice president. Now, as I just mentioned, Chester A. Arthur was highly involved in the spoil system as the U.S. Customs officer in New York. Now, the Democrats ultimately chose Winfield Scott Hancock, who was the Union commander and a hero at the Battle of Gettysburg, and was also a very popular individual in U.S. politics at the time. However, Garfield ultimately won a narrow victory over Hancock. Once again, he had no majority of the popular vote, so he was obviously forced to involve himself in the spoil system to repay the people who helped him to get into office. However, Garfield made a mistake by not repaying one individual, and on July 2nd, 1881, a man by the name of Charles Guiteau shot and killed Garfield, allegedly yelling, "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts." Evidently, Guiteau wanted to be rewarded for political support of Garfield. He had written a speech for Garfield during his campaign, and Guiteau wanted the ambassadorship to France, which was a very, very high position in the U.S. government at the time. Now, ultimately, the assassination of Garfield was blamed on the spoil system, as you can imagine, and it prompted cries for change in the federal government. Here's a picture of the assassination of Garfield. And as a result of Garfield's assassination, Chester A. Arthur, who, as I mentioned before, was a highly corrupt politician in the U.S. Customs Office in New York, becomes President of the United States of America. However, wisely, Chester A. Arthur begins to distance himself from the stalwarts when he assumed office. Now, as mentioned, Arthur was previously a very loyal party man. However, he understood that his presidency didn't owe him or wasn't owed to any political favors like the presidencies of Hayes or Garfield was. And as a result of this, it put him in a position to actually reform the civil service system. And in 1883, he signed into law what was known as the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which was actually the first anti-patronage legislation which was signed into official federal law. Now, what this Civil Service Act did was it created the Civil Service Commission. The Civil Service Commission listed all government patronage jobs, and it set aside 15% of these jobs as appointments that were to be determined through a competitive civil service examination process. Now, this was very smart for a number of reasons. First of all, it set aside these 15%, which were to be determined based on merit and not based on patronage. But it also declared that future presidents could enlarge this 15%, but it could never shrink it by moving one of these jobs into the patronage column. In other words, it could not be shrunken into a smaller list by future presidents. Now, Arthur also did a number of other things which brought the reformist spirit into the U.S. government, particularly into the realm of tariffs. Tariffs were taxes on international imports into the U.S., and they were very controversial during this period because legislatures ultimately bent to the will of businessmen who wanted higher tariffs to force Americans to buy their products, namely to buy domestic goods. On the other hand, however, lower tariffs would reduce prices and make it easier for the average Americans to buy goods and would lower their cost of living. Now, lower tariffs were highly favored by working class families and farmers, and out of concern for these individuals, Arthur created the U.S. Tariff Commission in 1882, which would investigate the propriety of increasingly high tariffs. Now, ultimately, the commission recommended a 25% rollback on tariffs, which was very, very high. But Arthur could only pass what was known as the mongrel tariff of 1883, which lowered tariff rates by barely 5%. However, this was a start. Now, all of Arthur's reforms basically convinced Republican leaders that as the 1884 presidential election approached, Arthur wasn't really their man. They didn't like the sort of reforms that he was attempting to impose upon their party. But the problem was that no leader could be found in the party due to corruption. And ultimately what this led to was a splinter faction of Republicans known as the Mugwumps. You have that on the slide in front of you. And this is actually taken from the Algonquin Indian phrase for great chief. Now, the Democrats ultimately courted the Mugwump vote by nominating Grover Cleveland, who was governor of New York at the time. And they were able to entice the Mugwumps to vote for Grover Cleveland due to the fact that Grover Cleveland attacked machine politics in New York City during his time as governor. Now, there was a very close election, but ultimately Cleveland won, despite the fact that there was a slight controversy due to the fact that he fathered a child out of wedlock, and this caused some negative publicity for Cleveland, but he won. And Cleveland added little blows to the reforms that were struck by Arthur. All right, first of all, he was the first Democratic president since 1856, and the Democrats wanted to make use of the spoils system since they now had access to the political positions again. So as a result, Cleveland was not able to do as much as he wanted to get rid of the political corruption and the spoils system. But he did reform business regulations and tariffs. However, in 1886, the Supreme Court ruled that individual states could not regulate interstate transport. And the Cleveland urged, as a response to this, that Congress pass the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Basically, what this did it would create the Interstate Commerce Commission, also known as the ICC, to oversee railroad prices and ensure their reasonability for customers. And this was a very important shift because, as discussed in previous lectures, in the past, they offered big rebates to customers that could provide big business, such as Rockefeller Standard Oil, and they offered very high rates to small farmers, etc., which were really hurt by this. So this was a very important innovation and very important reform that Grover Cleveland instituted. So in spite of the fact that Cleveland did embrace the spoils system because the Democrats had not had access to this in a long time, he did institute the ICC. However, even the ICC was a relatively slow progressive institution because of the fact that it really lacked teeth within the American political system. And eventually the Supreme Court undermined the ICC by saying that rate regulations violated the 14th Amendment, which provided protection against depriving people from property without due process. And basically what it was saying is that the railroad owners were being deprived of the profits that they were due to without due process. And ultimately, this led to the failure of the Interstate Commerce Act. Now, in the next election, the Republican Party nominated Benjamin Harrison to counter Grover Cleveland in the next election. And Harrison was actually the grandson of former President William Henry Harrison, so he had a very good pedigree, and they thought he would be a good candidate to defeat Cleveland. Ultimately, Cleveland won the popular vote, as many other presidents had done before. However, Harrison won the key electoral states of New York and New Jersey, and as a result, he won the presidency. Now, after the election, Harrison returned to many of the corrupt policies of his predecessors, including a return to high tariffs and the strengthening of the spoils system. In fact, the McKinley tariff, as it was known, raised some rates by as much as 50%, which actually is the highest in American history. Now, some of Harrison's policies did try to help the average Americans, but they were largely ineffective as a result of the spoils system and as a result of corruption in Washington, D.C. For example, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 prohibited business monopolies as what they called conspiracies in restraint of trade. But this was seldom enforced during the first decade of its existence, and it really lacked the teeth to go after these big monopolies, such as were discussed in the third lecture. There was also the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which basically called for the minting of more coins and the raising of prices on farm goods to help farmers pay off debts. But it really couldn't undo previous policies and failed as well. Moreover, other measures were also proposed by Harrison to help African Americans in the South, such as the Force Bill, which was aimed at helping Southern voters and education, and also the Education Bill, which was aimed at supporting education and literacy rates under or with African Americans. But both of these met defeat as well. And so you can see during this period that the political establishment, particularly the presidential seat, lacked any real power to affect change in America, largely due to the spoil system and the corruption which was taking place within American politics. Now, ultimately, this brings us to the second and last part of this lecture, which is going to deal with farmer organization. Now, as mentioned in plenty of the previous sections of this lecture, the farmers were some of the individuals which were struck hardest by the presidential policies of this period, particularly the high tariffs, the low prices of crops, and everything that the large corporations were doing, including the political parties. And so this section of the lecture will discuss the sort of steps that the farmers made to improve their lot in life. Now, the most important issue facing farmers and facing many people in the United States were monetary policies and the issue of gold or silver. Which one was better? Should both be used? Should one be used? Etc. And this was actually most important to the working class because they needed more money to pay for their things. And currently, or in the current system back then, there was too little gold to help the people in the United States. They had too little viable ways to pay people. Now, there were attempts at an early point at a bimetallic standard. Basically, this means that there would be gold and silver within the American system, and this would provide more money in circulation. Therefore, it would help the farmers and it would help the working class who would have more access to money. However, the government was very committed to the gold standard during this period, and in fact, in 1873, they actually demonetized silver completely. Now, ultimately, this benefited businessmen who traded with foreign countries, but it created more debt for farmers and for the working class. And the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1893 by Grover Cleveland made many farmers, or led many farmers, to take control of the political process itself, since Washington clearly wasn't helping them have more access to money. Now, here's a cartoon illustrating the benefits of the metallic standard, and you can see one side says monometallism, and you have a pauper family, a poor family on one side, and on the other side you have bimetallism, in which you have a worker in a factory and his daughter running around happy in her dress. So this was a political message back then that bimetallism was much better than monometallism. Now, the challenges facing farmers during this period were extremely significant. We've talked about some of these already: the high prices for goods such as farming equipment and animals, the high tariffs which were imposed on shipping goods to various locations, and also foreign competition. The competition from other countries and the products that they produced were all big issues for the farmers during this period and ultimately led them to organize. However, perhaps the biggest issue facing farmers was overproduction. Ultimately, the overproduction of crops caused prices to fall. And there's a long story leading up to this, but due to Western expansion of the homestead farms and industrialization, which led to new farming tools, this ultimately created greater crop yields. And as the farmers fell into debt, they produced more, which is logical because they wanted to get out of debt. But by producing more, this actually lowered the prices for their goods. It's the law of supply and demand. Now, the notion that their own overproduction was the greatest contributing factor to their debt was really a foreign concept to farmers because they did not have an education in economics, and they thought that by producing more, they would be able to earn more money. However, the complete opposite was the case, and this caused big problems for farmers. Now here's a photo of a homesteading hut in 1898 in North Dakota, and these are the sorts of conditions that farmers faced back then, and these are the sorts of individuals who would have been affected by overproduction. Now, ultimately, the White House didn't seem to care about the sorts of issues that farmers were having to deal with during this period. In 1878, federal law set the amount of paper money in circulation, and Harrison's Sherman Silver Act was too modest to help the farmers have more access to money. In short, the farmers had a big stack of bills from banks, etc., but they needed a big stack of money to help them repay them. They needed more money in circulation. But as mentioned, the White House wasn't doing anything to help them. So the farmers decided to take things into their own hands, and their initial response was to organize into groups that were very similar to labor unions. In 1867, Oliver Hudson Kelley organized what were known as the Patrons of Husbandry, which was better known as the Grange. And the Grangers actually grew to over 1.5 million members in less than a decade. So they were very, very popular during this period. Basically, Kelley's philosophy argued that farmers could best help themselves by creating farmers' cooperatives in which they would pool together their resources to obtain better shipping rates from the railroads and other organizations or other companies, along with better prices on seeds and fertilizer and machinery. So in other words, through numbers, they would create a better situation for themselves. And at the state level, this did actually bring brief success in the passage of, for example, the Granger Law, which regulated railroad rates and prices charged by grain elevator operations. In other words, the machines used to transport grain in the fields. The Greenback Party was also formed by Grange members because they thought that they could affect politics in this way. And the Greenbacks, as is probably obvious, was named for their support of print currency, or greenbacks, which is also the slang for print currency today, not based on the gold standard. So they didn't want the gold standard, they didn't want silver standard, they wanted print currency. And the Greenback Party actually was successful within Congress. There were 15 Congress members elected. However, it was ultimately a short-lived party, and it had little impact on the daily lives of everyday Americans. In fact, the Supreme Court eventually ruled against Illinois and other states for passing Granger laws, which control railroad rates, etc. And the argument was, as was discussed in the previous section, that the states could not control interstate commerce, that the state had no right to deprive the large corporations of their profits. And ultimately, after 1888, the Greenback Party failed from the American political realm. Now here is a promotional poster from the Grangers, which you can see demonstrates the benefits from organization, the fruitfulness from organization, and as I mentioned, it was a very popular organization with 1.5 million members during this period. Now, the next step in organization was the Farmers Alliance, and the Farmers Alliance was more successful in many ways than the Grangers, largely because of the numbers that it was able to accumulate. And the Farmers Alliance was basically a conglomeration of 3 regional alliances, which had formed in the mid-1800s. Now, the leader of the Farmers Alliance was a man by the name of Dr. Charles McQueen, who was the leader of a group known as the Southern Alliance, which was based in Texas. And McQueen basically urged a national alliance between three different alliances: his alliance, the Southern Alliance, the Northwestern Alliance in states like Michigan, etc., and then the Colored Alliance, which was made up of African Americans. Now, a man by the name of Tom Watson was the leader of the current alliance, or the Colored Alliance at the time. And this was also a very large alliance in many ways. It had 1 million members. Now, the Farmers Alliance did successfully come together, but racism ultimately splintered the group into three. Nevertheless, it managed to craft a national agenda and to appeal to a large group of the membership in spite of the racism which was exhibited between different groups. Now, the Farmers Alliance was the largest group in America at the time in terms of an alliance or a organization of farmers. It had 2.5 million members. 1.5 million of these were white and 1 million were black. And it's noteworthy that the movement also featured a number of prominent roles for women. In fact, 250 women joined the movement during this period. And the women saw joining the Farmers Alliance as an important step towards national suffrage. They could vote in the alliance, and they could also stand for office in the organization. In fact, the spokeswoman, Mary Elizabeth Lease of Kansas, who spoke about membership in the Farmers Alliance, referred to it as an opportunity to raise less corn and more hell. Now, here's an example of the Farmers Alliance flag, and you can see that it says, "The most good for the most people." And then you have the different things that the Farmers Alliance stand for, such as wisdom, justice, moderation, free trade, and alliance. Now, the goals of the Farmers Alliance were also multifaceted, and it was very similar to the Grange in a number of respects. However, the primary goal of the Farmers Alliance was to regulate railroad prices. They also wanted to create an inflationary monetary policy to bring more money into the American system, so farmers would have more access to money, very similar to what we discussed in relation to the Grangers. However, the thing that made them unique was something known as the Sub-Treasury Plan. Now, the Sub-Treasury Plan, and I've given you the different steps here below it, Sub-Treasury Plan would basically allow the farmers and the government to control the price of goods and therefore allow the farmers to make more money. And the way it would work is as follows. Basically, the federal government would store the farmers' crops in government warehouses for a brief period of time. And during this time, the government would provide loans to the farmers worth 80% of the crop prices at the time. Therefore, the farmers would have access to cash to settle debts and purchase goods. Now, the warehousing of the goods would also help the government and help the farmers control the prices of the market. And when the market prices rose, the farmers could take their crops out of the warehouses and sell them at higher prices. After that, they would repay the loans and have profit remaining, which they could improve their farms with. And a lot of economists at the time thought this idea and this concept had a lot of merit. The federal government, however, never seriously considered it. They questioned the propriety of the government serving as a rural creditor, and they never gave it any serious thought. However, this was a key element of the Farmers Alliance platform. Now, the Farmers Alliance ultimately became very angry at the federal government for its unwillingness to address the plight of the everyday farmer. And ultimately, Charles Macqueen and the Farmers Alliance created a political party whose membership, if elected, could enact real change within the United States government. In 1891, it formed what was known as the Populist Party, also known in some circles as the People's Party, and it had modest success, particularly in Kansas, Nebraska, and North Dakota and South Dakota. In fact, it had a number of state legislatures, one governor, and some congressmen. So because of the success that it had, in 1892, it thought, well, maybe we can take the presidency as well. And it actually hoped to pull over a third-party upset in the 1892 election. At the convention of the party, of the People's Party or the Populist Party, which took place in Omaha, Nebraska, they wrote the Omaha Platform to explain all the goals of the party to the American public. And it was actually written by a man by the name of Ignatius Donnelly. And in this Omaha platform, he vilified railroad workers, bankers, and big businessmen. And he called for the adoption of the sub-treasury plan. He also called for government control over the railroads. He called for the end to the national bank system. He called for the creation of a federal income tax. And he called for the direct election of U.S. senators. He believed, and the Populist Party believed, that a proactive federal government would support the social and economic welfare of all Americans. And this is really what they pushed for. And to get these goals across, they nominated James B. Weaver as the candidate for the Populist Party. During the same period, Grover Cleveland was nominated by the Democrats, and Benjamin Harrison was nominated by the Republicans, as we discussed before. Cleveland ultimately won, and this was the first non-consecutive terms that were ever held by a President of the United States. In other words, Grover Cleveland was elected before, and then Harrison was elected, and then Grover Cleveland again. And this is the first example of non-consecutive terms in American history. And the significant point in terms of the Populist Party is that Weaver got a respectable 1 million votes. And they became very excited through this, and they hoped to form an alliance with the industrial workers so they could get more power before the 1896 election. Now here is a photograph from the People's Party convention in Omaha, Nebraska. And you can see the types of individuals which were involved in this political movement there. And here is an illustration which demonstrates the states which the Populist Party won. So you can see part of Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, Colorado, Kansas, and part of North Dakota. So they did have success and won the electoral votes in several states. Now, after Cleveland's election in 1892, the nation actually fell into one of the worst economic depressions that it ever had to this point. And as the federal government failed, Americans sought relief outside of the two-party system. So things are looking very good for the Populist Party at this point. And they seemed viable in many ways to many people. Now, the causes of the Depression of 1893 were multifaceted. One element that led to the Depression was speculation that was taking place in the railroads over the previous decades. The proliferation of railroad lines created the false impression among investors that the economy was growing. And the banks and investors didn't realize that All of this was actually built on an economic bubble, that the economy was not growing where the railroads were being placed. And when the railroad companies ultimately failed due to their expenses being higher than their returns, supporting businesses also failed, things like banks and steel mills, etc. And the beginning of the crisis actually started with the closure of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company in 1893. After the failure of this, investors in other railroads cashed in their bonds, and it starts a run at the bank and a ripple effect in the economy. From 1893 to 1894, employment rose from 3% to 19% among working class Americans. Some states were much higher than this. As a matter of fact, New York had over 35% unemployment, and Michigan had 43% unemployment. Almost half of the inhabitants of Michigan were without a job. And at its height, 3 million Americans were unemployed. Now, this is significant because by 1895, it was common for Americans to see homeless people on the streets, something that hadn't existed to the same point in the decades before this, and also to see soup kitchens, etc. And people sought relief from the federal government. They wanted the federal government to help. However, they quickly learned that a weak and inefficient government was really only interested in what we talked about before, namely the spoil system and patronage. And it was really in no position to help them. So the Americans ultimately looked elsewhere, and this was the Populist Party. Now, a prime example of people looking elsewhere is Coxley's Army. And in the spring of 1894, a businessman named Jacob Coxley led a march of unemployed Ohioans from Cincinnati all the way to Washington, D.C. Now, while in Washington, D.C., he hoped to urge Congress to pass public works legislation to create more jobs, like building roads, etc. The exact thing which we'll talk about, which happened during the New Deal, in which President Roosevelt created jobs through public works. And as Coxley was marching through the different states, his number and the number of people in his so-called army actually grew to over 500 people. However, once they reached Washington, D.C., their cries for relief were ultimately ignored by Washington. And in fact, Coxley and others were actually arrested for trespassing on grass outside of the U.S. Capitol. Now, this frustration as well led to many people considering to support the Populist Party, because clearly, if these poor people marching to Washington, D.C. and looking for help were arrested because of something as simple as trespassing on the grass, these were not the people that you want in the government. Now, here's a photograph of Coxley's army marching its way to Washington, D.C. And it's noteworthy in terms of popular literature at the time. There are a number of parallels between the book The Wizard of Oz, which was famous during this period, and Coxley's Army. And many literary experts and historians have asserted that there is a parallel between these, and that L. Frank Baum, who was a journalist and wrote The Wizard of Oz, was attempting to satirize the Coxley's Army. Now, L. Frank Baum was a journalist who rose to prominence at the end of the 19th century. And The Wizard of Oz, which is all about a girl from struggling Kansas who hoped to get help from a wonderful wizard who proved to be a fraud, has led to the speculation that the story, The Wizard of Oz, actually reflects Baum's sympathies for the Populist Party, which was galvanized in the Midwest, places like Kansas, and also by Southern farmers calling for federal reform. Now, it's ultimately unclear, but the populists did look for answers just like Dorothy did in The Wizard of Oz. And the government in Washington also proved to be meek rather than magical, just like The Wizard of Oz did. Here's a photograph from The Wizard of Oz book, and you can see Dorothy riding on the lion and the Tin Man and the Scarecrow, right? And many people assert that this is a political allegory for Coxley's army. Apart from Coxley's army, there were also several other events which punctuated the growing depression during this period. Some of them were violent, and some of them we already talked about in the previous lecture, including strikes. As discussed in the previous lecture, the Pullman strike of 1894 was notable for its nationwide impact since it shut down the national railroad system during the Depression. And it's noteworthy that this began immediately after Coxley's March. Now, in the election of 1896, all signs really pointed towards a populist victory. Americans by this point had been shown the inability of Republicans and Democrats to deal with the Depression and with the economic situation in the United States. And the Populist Party also had more experience by this point, more experience in the 1892 election. And they also had a number of local victories under their belt. To make matters worse, the Republicans held steadfast in defense of the gold-based standard, which, as mentioned before, the farmers were fed up with, and also they were very highly protective of tariffs because they were in the pockets of rich businessmen. The candidate for the Republicans was William McKinley, governor of Ohio, and the Democrats at this point chose William Jennings Bryan, a congressman from Nebraska. Now, the Democrats advocated a silver-based monetary system, which was more appealing to the farmers, and they also advocated more silver minting. Now, they were also more familiar with the farmers' plight, and William Jennings Bryan also saw a lot of merit in the sub-treasury system, which, as mentioned before, was the proposal put forward by the Populist Party in an earlier era. And in fact, William Jennings Bryan was really the ideal populist candidate. But the problem that arose for the populists is that the Democrats got them first. Now, ultimately, the populists had two options. They could locate another candidate, they could find another candidate to run for their party, or they could form an alliance with the Democrats and support Bryan, but risk losing their identity as a third political party. Ultimately, they chose the latter of the two options, and you can see in cartoons from the period, this one illustrating the 1896 campaign, that many viewed the appointment of Bryan as basically swallowing the Democratic Party. You can see Bryan here as a snake swallowing the Democratic Party, which is portrayed as a donkey. Now, as just mentioned, the Populist Party ended up endorsing Bryan with their party's nomination, and this actually occurred 3 weeks after the Democrats nominated him under their party's nomination. But, however, the Populists did not do everything that the Democrats did. They actually chose their own vice president to run alongside Bryan, namely Georgia Senator Tom Watson. And the race for president during this period became very, very heated. McKinley, who was the Republican nominee, conducted a front porch campaign. And in this campaign, he basically allowed media members and other individuals to come to his front porch, hence the name. And he held to long-held party principles during this period. Bryan, on the other hand, delivered speeches throughout the country in a way that was far different from previous elections. Many of his speeches were very fiery, and it ended up in a very close election. However, McKinley ultimately won, and he was the first president to win the majority of the popular vote in 24 years. Bryan's election was impressive, but it ultimately split the Democratic vote because some party members believed in the gold standard, and they ended up voting for the Republicans in this election. So this was an issue that probably contributed to Bryan's demise. Bryan's defeat in this election also attributed to the demise of the Populist Party. And ultimately, they gambled their future by throwing in their cards with the Democrats. And they did this because they basically destroyed their own identity in the process. After this election, critics of the populists basically referred to the populists as being Democrats in sheep's clothing. Moreover, a number of other factors also led to the decline of populism after this. First of all, there was discovery of vast gold deposits in Alaska, which was known as the Klondike Gold Rush of 1896 to 1899. And it made the United States and the farmers as well able to thrive on the gold standard. Moreover, there was the impending Spanish-American War, which began in 1898. And this actually fueled the American economy, brought them out of the Depression, and it also increased the demand from farm products. So farmers had more of a market to sell their goods. The Populist Party, however, remained in spirit in particular, and in a later lecture we will talk about how the reformist zeal of the Populist Party took on new forms as the 20th century unfolded. Finally, the last slide of this lecture gives you a demonstration of the 1896 election. As you can see, it was very close, but the Republicans ultimately won.